I watched the vice presidential debate for us. The debate was on CBS. Tim Walz is wearing a blue tie, because that's what the Democrats normally wear to these kinds of things. J.D. Vance is wearing a pink tie, because not all men, and I think he's trying to serve a certain amount of Kenergy. There are no opening statements, and the moderators start right in by being like, we are on the brink of World War III. They don't say World War III. They say, I think, war in the Middle East. But we all know they're talking about World War III. And then they ask both candidates if they would support Israel in taking a preemptive strike against Iran. Tim Walz has a little bit of a stumbly start, but he says essentially what Kamala Harris always says when she's asked any question about Israel, which is that October 7th was bad. What's happening in Gaza is also bad. We want peace in the Middle East. And then Walz goes on to make what I actually think is a pretty good point, but I don't know if it's going to play, that what we really need in times of global conflict is a reasonable human being leading the country, not someone who tweets threats at foreign leaders. And he also points out the fact that Trump's ex-chief of staff, Secretary of Defense, I think? Yeah, his chief of staff, his Secretary of Defense, and his national security advisor, people who held those positions, have all said that he's unfit to be the leader of our nation. And then Walz also takes a dig at Trump for being almost 80, because, if he doesn't, what has this all been about? J.D. Vance has a little bit more of a polished start, which is this 60-second little intro about himself that he was clearly going to say no matter what question was asked. One might say, I would say that Tim Walz probably should have had the same kind of thing prepared. Anyway, J.D. Vance is like, what's important about me is I grew up middle class. Middle class, GI Bill, middle class, GI Bill. Also, I think we should let Israel do whatever they want. Then the moderators get to Hurricane Helene. They're like, Hurricane Helene was very bad, is very bad. 160 plus people have died. More people are missing. Scientists say climate change is making these kinds of things worse. What are you guys going to do about it? J.D. Vance goes first. He's like, Hurricane Helene is very bad. I know it's bad. I have seen pictures of it. And then he says essentially, look, let's say that climate change is real, which I'm not saying it is. I'm not saying it's real. But if it was real, it's all Kamala Harris's fault. Tim Walz is like, remember the time that the other guy's boss said that climate change was a hoax that would, if anything, just create more beachfront property? Then he's going to do this thing where he both brags about the clean jobs that the Biden-Harris administration has created, or that have been created under the Biden-Harris administration via the Inflation Reduction Act, but also doesn't scare away the people who think that Kamala Harris, who is definitely not going to ban fracking, is going to ban fracking. Then the moderators ask J.D. Vance if he thinks that climate change is a hoax, and then J.D. Vance says that it's actually Kamala Harris who thinks that climate change isn't real. Then Tim Walz, again, is like, we are producing the most natural gas and oil of any time in history. Then he brings up that thing that Donald Trump did where he invited a bunch of oil executives to Mar-a-Lago and said that if they gave him a bunch of money, they could do whatever they want. Then Brennan starts asking about immigration, and she goes to J.D. Vance first, and she's like, how are you going to pull off the largest mass deportation in the history of the United States? And also, when you're doing that, would you separate children from their parents in the process? And then J.D. Vance is like, first, this is all Kamala's fault. She let a bunch of fentanyl over the border. Second, we need to build the wall. Third, a bunch of immigrants are criminals. Fourth, if people who come here can't find jobs working at below minimum wage, then they'll leave and we can be back to having Americans work jobs at minimum wage. And finally, this is all Kamala Harris's fault. Tim Walz brings up the fact that Donald Trump recently lobbied against the most conservative immigration bill in the history of our nation, endorsed by the Border Patrol, would have added 1,500 more jobs for the Border Patrol. Donald Trump lobbied against that because he wanted something to run on this cycle, and man, is he running on it. Tim Walz also brings up the fact that Donald Trump didn't get Mexico to pay for the wall. And then Brennan is like, hey, JD, you never answered the question, would you support separating parents from their children? And JD Vance is like, look, what I'm trying to say is that everything is Kamala Harris's fault. And then Tim Walz is like, it's also not cool that as a part of this whole debate, a bunch of people with legal immigration status are being attacked in Springfield, Ohio, which leads to this viral fact check moment where the moderators are like, to clarify, Springfield, Ohio does have a large Haitian population with temporarily protected legal status. And then JD Vance is like, the rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check us. Then we get to the economy and they ask Tim Walz about Harris's proposed tax cuts for middle-class people and small businesses and the Wharton School's prediction that that could add $1.2 trillion to the national deficit. And Tim Walz essentially makes this argument that investing in the middle class yields results. Walz also says that all Trump cares about is keeping his promises to the ultra-wealthy and that doing so massively increased the deficit while he was in office. Then Walz talks about what the Harris campaign is calling a 20% sales tax that Trump is proposing. And if you are from the Harris-Walz campaign and you happen to be watching this video, I think you should just explain it as a tariff. I think people are smart enough to understand the implications. Then the moderators turn to JD Vance and they're like, the Wharton School also says that your boss's plan would add $5.8 trillion to the national deficit. What say you to that? And then JD Vance is like, well, I don't think economists are that smart. And Donald Trump says that when he's president, you will all have more money and world peace, and you should believe him. You should just believe him about that. And then Tim Walz is like, what do you think Mr. Vance has against experts? Why is he so worried about them? And then he looks at the camera and he's like, aren't you guys annoyed that you have to pay taxes and Donald Trump doesn't? Then we get to the part where they're like, tell us about yourselves. And the moderators ask Tim Walz about the whole travel to China thing. And Tim Walz is like, I am a regular guy. I'm a good guy. I'm a teacher. I have years of service. That's my intent. I think you all know my intent is not to lie to you, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, I misspoke. And the moderators asked JD Vance about that time in 2016 when he compared Donald Trump to Hitler, and that time in 2020 when he said that Donald Trump hadn't delivered on his promises about the economy. JD Vance is like, look, I changed my mind. I made a mistake by believing reporters in the past. I never should have done that. Then we get to reproductive choice, and Tim Walz is like, yeah, I think this is kind of a mind your own business type situation where we should let women decide what to do with their own bodies. Isn't it scary, this whole Project 2025 thing where they want to do a national registry of pregnancies? Then he brings up cases of women almost dying because they were unable to access life-saving care because it fell into the reproductive category. And then JD Vance is like, look, I know we as a party need to win people's trust back on this, and don't worry because I know a woman who had an abortion. Then he says that while democracy is messy, we should let the voters in each state decide what to do about this. Not like literally with their own bodies, but legislatively. JD Vance is also like, look, the thing is, women want to have babies. Tim Walz brings up Amber Thurman, who died because she was unable to access care in a restrictive state. JD Vance is like, yeah, I also think that Amber Thurman should be alive, but what are you trying to do? Like, force Catholic hospitals to provide abortions? Then we get to gun violence, and then JD Vance is like, I have kids, and of course, I think it's unfortunate that Kamala Harris's open border is causing school shootings. Tim Walz is like, my 17-year-old son actually witnessed a shooting at a community center. Then Tim Walz is like, I own guns, so does Kamala Harris. You can be a gun owner and believe in sensible gun regulation. And then JD Vance is like, I didn't know that your 17-year-old saw a shooting. I'm so sorry. That's terrible. The thing is, we have a mental health crisis. And what that means is that we should let law enforcement do whatever they want, and we should add more security to schools. And that will solve the mental health crisis. Then the moderators asked Tim Walz why his opinion on a national assault weapons ban has changed. He didn't used to support it, now he does. And he says he met with the parents of Sandy Hook victims. And also this is where we get the unfortunate moment quote where he says, I've become friends with school shooters. I am sure he meant to say that he became friends with the victims of school shootings. Anyway, that happened. That was a moment that occurred. He also says that we shouldn't stigmatize people with mental health issues, that just because you have mental health issues doesn't mean you're violent. Then we get to the housing crisis of it all, and the moderators ask Tim Walz how Harris plans to pay for everything she's proposing, like tax credits for first-time home buyers, $3 million new homes being built, etc. Tim Walz is essentially like, home ownership is good for the economy. It leads to more stable employment, etc. People will pay the loans back, will make the money back. It'll be good for us in the long run. Then the moderators ask JD Vance about Donald Trump's plan to seize federally protected lands and build there. JD Vance is like, well, this is actually kind of all Kamala Harris's fault because she let in a bunch of immigrants and they're taking up all the housing. It's definitely not like a corporate landlord's problem. Anyway, drill baby drill. Then we get to healthcare. And JD Vance is asked about his boss's concepts of a plan comment. And he's essentially like, well, it would have been boring. You guys don't want to hear his whole plan. Nobody presents their whole plan. And also, while we're at it, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, that only worked because of Donald Trump, who famously tried to get rid of it. And then Tim Walz is like, no, Donald Trump tried to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, and he would have gotten away with it too if it hadn't been for John McCain. And then where would we all be? People with pre-existing conditions would have no coverage. Then we get to childcare and paid family leave. And Tim Walz is essentially like, paid family leave is good for the economy. It increases employee retention, etc. And then JD Vance is like, look, I care about this too. My wife is a working parent. He really frames the whole thing as a woman's issue, which I would argue is a part of the problem. He also makes this argument essentially that what women really want is to be stay-at-home moms, and we should be figuring out a way for them to do that. And this is one of those things where I'm like, if the conservatives just got like maybe a little further on the point, like they'd almost be at proposing a universal basic income, but they're not quite there. And then we get to the issue of democracy. And the moderators ask JD Vance, who has said that he doesn't think that the 2020 election should have been certified, even though all the governors of all the states certified the votes in their states, if he would feel the same way about this election, if all the governors certify the votes in their states, should the election be certified. And JD Vance says, the thing is, Kamala Harris really ruined the economy. And then he's like, but I will answer your question because you did ask it. And what I think is most important here is that we don't dwell on the past, okay? Trump left office, and the real threat of the future is censorship. Kamala Harris wants to censor misinformation. Don't you think that's insane? And then Tim Walz is like, no, I do think that whole insurrection thing, actually, it was a pretty big deal. And I think it's pretty important that we can all say, everybody running for office, that we can all say that we will, at the end of this, shake hands and walk away and not try and lead a mob into the Capitol. And then Tim Walz asks JD Vance if he believes that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. And JD Vance says, I'm just focused on the future. And the crazy thing is, I think that JD Vance knows that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, and he's just afraid to say so, which is perhaps the scariest thing of all. And we're at closing statements. You did it. You're almost there. Walz thanks his opponent for being there. He thanks the moderators. He thanks us all for watching. He says that he himself would not have expected to be a part of a coalition that includes Bernie Sanders, Dick Cheney, and Taylor Swift. But here we are, and that's the power of joy and optimism in politics, and we want to build the middle class, and I humbly ask for your vote this November. JD Vance thanks Tim Walz, thanks the moderators, thanks everybody for watching, and then he's like, I just want to reiterate that I grew up poor. And then he's like, Kamala Harris has ruined everything, but we do have the most beautiful country in the world. I love everybody I meet on the campaign trail. I meet people who are struggling to afford food, and they tell me that they're praying for me. And isn't that nice? Here are my thoughts. I was hoping for Tim Walz to be a little bit more feisty, but I do think that he hit his stride a little bit as the debate went on, and he's smart. Listening to him talk, you can tell he's smart. The scary thing is I think JD is smart too. And man, the amount of media training that man has clearly had in the last month is wild. I also don't think this debate is going to matter that much. Nothing shocking was said. But we'll see.